You know that Keeley Companies is all about fostering the world-class culture through their incredible cultural pillars. Well, it was time to add a seventh cultural pillar, Keeley Green. Guided by the mission to raise the sustainability standards by which they design, build, operate, and live, Keeley Green is dedicated to using a holistic approach to leave a positive impact on our environment, create a future that is sustainable for generations to come. In the words of Rusty Keeley, we are just getting started. You can learn more about that just getting started mentality and all the work they do by visiting my friends at Keeley Companies online at KeeleyCompanies.com.
Welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. John is the two-time national best-selling author of On Fire and In Awe. He's a world-class inspirational speaker, the host of the Live Inspired podcast, and he's the real-life inspiration behind the major motion picture Soul on Fire. Each week, John interviews extraordinary individuals about their life stories so you can more fully live your life story. Here's your host, John O'Leary.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Live Inspired podcast with John O'Leary. You're going to love today's episode because you're going to love the man we're sharing this conversation with. His name is Paul Anleitner. He's a cultural theologian. He's the author of Based on a True Story, and he's also the president and CEO of Goodmakers. It's where they help individuals understand how culture and the stories we believe shape our search for meaning. So Paul draws from theology, from philosophy, from science, and in doing so, he is now the leading voice on navigating today's cultural shifts with hope, with wisdom, and with purpose. Today, Paul joins us to share how the stories we embrace influence the way we see ourselves and the world around us, why our culture is moving beyond cynicism and endless deconstructionism, and what it looks like to rebuild lives rooted in meaning, in truth, and in authentic community. And I know these sound like topics that may not relate to you specifically. It relates more to the community as a whole. But I'm telling you, my friends and family, the stories we pay attention to influence the lives that we lead. This today will be a story worthy, I'm telling you right now, of paying attention to. If you've ever wondered why so many people feel disconnected, or maybe you find yourself longing for greater purpose and hope and belonging, today's conversation with Paul is for you. You will leave ignited, inspired, and reminded that the foundation is firm. The headwinds we face are indeed real, but the best is yet to come. So grab your favorite Live Inspired journal, pull your seat up a little bit closer to that radio volume, turn that baby up right, and get ready to be inspired by my friend, now yours. His name is Paul Anleitner. Paul, welcome to Live Inspired with John O'Leary.
John, it's an honor to sit down and talk with you. I'm so moved by your story, and it's a pleasure to get to sit here and connect with you.
Well, man, sometimes the best of the conversation takes place. Unfortunately, before I hit record, you told me right before I hit record what your last name means.
Yeah.
Mine means I'm somewhere from Ireland, County Cork, and I came over and started a life over here. Your last name means something else. What does your last name stand for?
Yeah, it's German, Anleitner. People have a hard time saying it, and understandably so, but it means something like lamplighter, light giver, teacher. My dad was a teacher. It runs in my blood. I think I have something baked into me that wants to illuminate, to tell a better story, to help people see something true, good, and beautiful that maybe they've missed before. So that's what moves me, John.
So if you and I were at some random coffee shop somewhere in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and I bump into you and I say, Paul, I like your last name. What do you do? How do you
Yeah.
respond to that?
So it's the way I would frame it for most people to understand is I write and speak about the way culture and story impacts, influences our own quest for meaning and our own sense of story. And that would be the best way to describe it. The more technical term people might use is I'm a cultural theologian, which means I try to grapple with culture in such a way that helps people do what theologians do. And that's figuring out, well, who's God? What's my place in the story? Grapple with the deep questions of life.
You know, I never understood why you need to be a theologian to grapple with who's God
Yeah.
and why am I here and where did this all come from? It seems very passive to let those people in the high towers wrestle with that rather than all of us say, gosh, these things that those guys are asking, maybe we should as well. So it's part of the reason why you're on our conversation today. I want you to help us wrestle with these big questions. And maybe we begin with the simple question of where'd you grow up and what was life like for you as a kid?
So I grew up in the Metro Detroit area, blue collar neighborhood. My parents were first generation Christians, so they had become followers of Jesus in the 70s, late 70s. I grew up in a churched context, so I'm very familiar with that world. Into my college and adult years, I spent a lot of time in education, teaching in academic settings. And then in the last 8 to 10 years or so, I picked up on a shift that was happening in education, right? So I said, I'm a teacher, light giver, right? That's what I want to be. Picked up on this shift, had some very encouraging but sobering conversations with people about the way academia is changing and the way people are actually learning about the world and having those deep questions answered. I was always a ancient history, philosophy, theology guy, all of that stuff, those deep questions about life and meaning and purpose. And it dawned on me that this technological revolution we were going through was changing the avenues in which people would go explore those questions. So I moved out of the classroom into the podcasting space. This was about 8 years ago. It feels like everybody has a podcast now, but at the time it was
Yeah.
challenging. Not a lot of people were doing it then. And so I started doing that to help people deal with the sorts of questions you're talking about. Because you're exactly right, John. The word theology is very intimidating for a lot of people. And it is. There's a niche academic discipline about people that give their whole lives to studying that. But everybody has these questions, John. Everybody has questions about why am I here? What's the point? And everybody has a framing of their life inside of a story. And so the thing I've become most interested in trying to help people is understand their life inside of a story. And that comes really naturally to people, right? I mean, even when we sat down before hitting record and you were telling me about yourself, you didn't start listing off just random dispassionate facts. I have brown hair, I'm wearing a blue striped shirt today. You started telling me some of your story, an incredible, inspiring story. But we see ourselves inside of a story, and I try to help people understand the other stories that are influencing their own internal story.
As a kid, as you're growing up, as your parents are raising, you're witnessing incredible leadership and light bearers around you. But from reading your book and just following you online, it also seems like you're observing deconstruction. It's a
Absolutely.
term that I think a lot of our listeners and viewers may not even super be familiar with. So first of all, what is deconstruction?
Yeah, deconstruction, there's two ways that term is most commonly used. You can see it used in maybe the more personal, anecdotal way. Sometimes people say, I've been deconstructing my faith or I've been deconstructing my past. And what they mean by that is that they are noticing, they're observing things about their beliefs, about the story they were living in, and they're critiquing, tearing those down. I sometimes like to picture it as you're picking up a sledgehammer and you're doing some demo work on a house, right? And there is an appropriate place for demolition, right? If you have a house that's falling apart, it is good for you to observe what's broken here. And there
Yeah.
might be some demolition work that needs to be done first before you can move on to fixing it. And then there's also kind of the broader philosophical notion of deconstruction, which comes from the postmodern thinkers of the mid 20th century. And a lot of that stuff was influential in academia, but didn't really move into the mainstream of pop culture. Those ideas didn't get disseminated broadly in pop culture until Hollywood really picked them up in the 1990s. And so deconstruction means I'm looking at the past through the lens of suspicion. I'm looking at the story I was living in through this lens of suspicion, of cynicism, and I'm looking to tear down. And so while there is a place for that, the argument of my book, John, is that we have lived in this culture in which deconstruction has become our story. It has been treated as the highest good and with no end in sight. And so while you might step into, let's say, the house of faith or the house of your childhood, and you look back and you go, man, that was probably broken. That thing didn't work.
Right.
There's a difference between reform and deconstruction for deconstruction's sake, John. My concern has been for my generation in particular. I was born in 1983. So for the younger Gen Xers, millennials, and older Gen Z, we were born into a culture that prioritized, celebrated, valorized deconstruction, but with very little picture of, well, what do we rebuild toward? Do we ever reconstruct? I'm very encouraged that many people in my generation, younger, I think it happens for the baby boomers as well, are starting to wake up and realize, hang on, we can't just carry a sledgehammer around. The sledgehammer isn't the only tool. In fact, if
Yeah.
we only have a sledgehammer, what we end up with in the end is we tear down everything in this house and we're left cold, alone,
Mm.
without a place to live. And I'm encouraged people are starting to wake up and go, all right, I got to move from that deconstruction project to a reconstruction project, rebuilding, renewal. I think that's the moment we're in now, John.
You dropped a term that I think a lot of our listeners and viewers may not be familiar with. It's called postmodernism.
Yeah.
So the first time I ever read that was in a book by Henry Nouwen.
Mhm.
Nouwen's a great theologian and an awesome writer, I think. And he just talked about in the late 1960s, he would see young men and women showing up in his office, I think in Notre Dame at the time, completely hopeless and completely untethered. And he kept referring to them in this book as part of the postmodernism world. And I read that book in the late 90s and it made very little sense to me actually at the time. And now, as I look back on that term and the times we live in, it makes perfect sense to me on the role of postmodernism in the world we live in today. So tell our audience what postmodernism means.
Yeah, I mean, first, it'd probably be helpful to note the prefix post before modernism, right? And so that gives you a hint as to what, well, if we're talking post-modernism, we do need to understand that that world you're describing, let's say in academia in the 1960s into the late 20th century, they were grappling with, and the simplest way I put this is they were grappling with a story, a guiding cultural story that came before them. And that's the modern story. So, the modern story we could kind of summarize as this story that has been, in many ways, core to the American identity, because the American Revolution Project was born out of the modern story. And it valued things like individualism. So the notion that the individual has access to the truth and doesn't have to go through institutions, whether it was church or government, that you have access to the truth. That was a unique idea that emerged in this modern story. You also had values like meritocracy. So if you have access to the truth, John, individually, and there's many good things about the modern story, if you have access to the truth, well, then your position in life isn't bound by whether you were born a peasant or not. You can climb up the social status ladder, right? You think of the autobiographies of Benjamin Franklin, or you think of movies like Rocky. Rocky is telling that modern story, a guy born into blue collar, maybe even on the poverty end, and has pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Well, the postmodernists were looking at that story and they were going, that doesn't work. That
Yeah.
doesn't work. And here's the reasons why. So that's the deconstruction part. They're looking at the parts of that story and go, I don't think this works for everybody, right? Now, the modern story is insufficient. And in many ways, they were right about some key features, right? They were right about, yeah, not everybody can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The modern story was also saying, our story is objectively true. And the postmodernists came around and they said things like, well, what if the story you're living in isn't objectively true? Maybe it's masking a play for power. Very suspicious, right? And some of this stuff came about with the Cold War too, John. So, we're in this Cold War against the Soviets who have a very different guiding story in their culture and a lot of suspicions about, well, when this ends, will our story be the dominant story of some global empire? Very, very suspicious. And so the postmodernists come along and they go, well, every story is actually about those in power, masking that they want to keep and preserve their power. So when you think about practically, that story of young people walking into a professor's office feeling depressed, nihilistic, feeling despair, the downstream effect of telling everybody, well, every story is just masking a play for power. There is no objective truth. Objective truth is if you believe in that, you're either naive or you're falling for propaganda. The downstream effect of that, John, is that when people go, boy, if every story is propaganda, where am I supposed to live? Right?
Right.
Like, what story can I believe is true? And in some really funny and unique ways, you start seeing this stuff in pop culture. So let's take even, for example, in the 90s, the shift from the classic American sitcom model, from Leave It to Beaver to The Cosby Show to Full House, any one of those, they all followed a predictable pattern. We're using comedy to communicate what was actually a moral lesson. So you think of setting aside the later legal troubles of the star of The Cosby Show. You take The Cosby Show in the 80s, African American family. What is the message each week? Well, Bill is telling Theo, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, Theo. You better get done with school, graduate, and get out of our house. Because that's what Bill and Claire did. They were successful. It was the meritocracy story. And we get to the 1990s and we get this shift. And you can see it in real clear ways in Seinfeld. And I love Seinfeld. This isn't a knock on Seinfeld. But Seinfeld comes along and they start, Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld have either consciously or subconsciously kind of bought into that postmodern story. There's no objective truth, there's no objective moral lessons. And Larry David had a famous two sets of rules for each episode: no hugging and no learning. So Seinfeld has this kind of comedic nihilism. The characters never learn any moral lessons each week, right? They're actually pretty terrible people, which you get to at the very end of the series. And that's kind of the more comedic side. But you could also see less funny examples of this. I talk about in based on a true story, the year 1999, and I'm 16 years old, and I'm going into a movie theater and I'm watching a movie like Fight Club. And Fight Club had this very postmodern message. Everything you've believed about the American dream is a scam. Be
Yeah.
suspicious. And what was the solution? Well, the solution, at least implied for young men, was tear it all down, burn down the system. And interestingly enough, John, if you look even at the summer of 1999, Woodstock 99, it was the rebranding of the Woodstock of 1969, the Summer of Love, all of those values of then we're going to do our own Woodstock for my
Right.
generation. And if you look at the aftermath of Woodstock 99, it ended in literal fire and rubble.
Yeah.
Hordes of young men roving around the campgrounds at the end of the festival chanting, "Bleep you, I won't do it, you tell me," singing lyrics from a Rage Against the Machine song. There was a very different story that moved in. And so when you pick up on some of those flavors of cynicism, irony, deconstruction, those are some key flavors of postmodernism, or as I call, and based on true story, the postmodern anti-story. This notion there are no stories that you can trust.
What's the danger of living in a story that tells you there's no stories, no truth that you can trust? What's the real risk of watching The Matrix and thinking, you know what, maybe Keanu's onto something here. Maybe there is no truth anywhere ever.
Yeah, I mean, there's two dangers to it. And let's start with the most basic one is when you step back and realize if you're telling me that all stories mask a play for power, there are no true stories. There's a bit of irony in that that is itself a story. It's like the people that say, well, there's no objective truths, right? There's no absolutes. You're like, well, are you absolutely sure? It's paradoxical. So the thing starts to break down. And I think young people started realizing that. You're telling me there's no story that I can live in at all. And they start to realize, well, that's a story, right? But maybe on the more practical, personal side, the spiritual side, the inner side, the inner life side of that, John, is that people that believe there's no story that I can live in at all run against their very programming as humans. Humans are inherently storied creatures. What that means is that we see our lives in a story. This is baked into who we are. We can take that from the religious angle, the philosophical angle, but even in the last decade or so, the overwhelming evidence from the psychological, the cognitive sciences are showing humans are inherently storied creatures. Dan McAdams coined the term, the psychologist Dan McAdams coined the term narrative identity. We all see ourselves inside a story. Every time you introduce yourself to a new coworker, or a new neighbor, and you're like, hey, tell me about yourself, you start telling a story. So the reason why the notion that I can't trust any story at all is impossible to live in is because you and I, and our very identity, live inside of a story. And we cannot just make up our own because we're all in some shared experience of life together. And so when you hear over and over, well, I can't trust anything, I can't go to church because the story they tell there is propaganda, right? I can't read the great works of literature from the past and learn something from Shakespeare because, well, Shakespeare had these biases, and all I'm going to do is have a lens of suspicion over every story. It breaks down because you yourself have to choose a story to live in. It's impossible to not do that, John.
So you've mentioned Woodstock 99 and the difference between that and 1969. One was about love, one was about hate and anger. I mean, it really became a
For sure.
wild summer, representative in some regards of society at the time, believe it or not. Then the Fight Club and the Matrix, and then decades subsequently of trying to deconstruct and tear down what our parents and grandparents once believed to be true. What are we, if you're tearing something down, something goes in its place. What have
Mhm.
we begun replacing these things with then?
Yeah. So one of the things that has replaced that sense of there's a story higher than me that I need to trust has been this interest in self-authoring our own story. And self-authoring your own story can feel really appealing in some sense because you can step into that postmodern bubble and you start realizing, oh my gosh, there's no meaning to be found here. And I innately need meaning. And so you go looking for, like, well, how could I find meaning? And one very attractive alternative for people, because it does feel better than being depressed and in despair all the time, John, is, well, maybe I can just write my own story, right? Maybe I can just be the author of my own life. And there's a lot of appeal to that because for a moment, it does give you a sense of meaning. It does. Like, boy, I can write my own destiny. I can write my own story. I can author even my own identity, right? We see a lot of that with young people. Well, all the external labels placed on you, you can shirk all of those off. You
Yeah.
can decide you're a different species if you want, right? There's all sorts of radical self-authoring out there. The problem with self-authoring is that we're in a group project here altogether, right? So let me share an illustration I write about in the book. Years ago, a friend of mine told me of a colleague that wife had been going to therapy for years, and there's nothing wrong with going to therapy for years, but she came out of therapy with this notion that whether it was her therapist telling it to her directly or just she picked it up in culture, that her happiness was the number one priority. And the best way to achieve her happiness was going to be, I'm just going to write my own story. What that looked like for her in her life was, there was some pretty normal middle American marriage troubles she was going through. Her and her husband had a few kids, no infidelity, anything like that. But she was like, I think the real hindrance to my own happiness is my marriage and my children. I feel like I am entitled to write a better story for myself. So she packed up, moved to some place where it's always sunny and you can hang out on the beach with a margarita. And if you were to ask her, are you happier? Here's the funny thing. She might actually say yes. But there's a problem when we filter this all through the lens of individualism and my own individual happiness. Can I self-author my own story? Is guess who isn't happier? Her children, right? Like, it's not enough just to say, well, I can write my own story. Because you and I have to, John, if we were in the same neighborhood, right? You and I have to figure out as neighbors how to coexist and live together. And then we take that out to scale. And this is where things get really interesting, is that we scale that out from our neighborhood to our state, to our
Right.
country. We are doing something at a civilizational scale that, whether we are aware of it or not, is running on some story. And what I mean by that is that every civilization has a highest guiding story that holds that thing together. And so the problem, the real danger in just going, well, hey, I can just self-author my own story. I find myself a little bit happier than I was before, is that in the end, everybody's self-authoring their own story. It might look more like Mad Max future
Yeah.
or a Terminator 2, pick your favorite dystopian movie. What's the warning in all of them? Well, you know, people self-authoring their own vision of what human flourishing, my own flourishing should look like. This has to be a shared story. And so now we got to grapple with, is there a story that's beyond me, bigger than me, true, good, and beautiful, whether or not I believe it's true, good, or beautiful, that
Right.
actually works?
Yeah, so you mentioned a couple terms there that I'm highly aware of, but not always a huge fan of. And one of them is happiness, which sounds
Mhm.
like, well, how could you not like happiness, my
Yeah.
man?
Yeah.
I don't. I think kids want to be happy, but I think parents should desire for them joy, which is
Yeah.
completely different than happy. Happy's cheap. Happy's going off to a beach with an ice cream cone, and misery is getting a sunburn and having ice cream all over your hands afterwards. And it happens quickly. So what you're pushing back on is this idea that happiness is the call for a life. And what you're trying to invite us into, I think, is something greater and something more meaningful. So where then, if not a beach, if not an ice cream cone, where will people find greater meaning in their life?
Yeah, and that you've said the word a couple times now. You want more than just temporary happiness. What we want deep down is meaning. And meaning, it's interesting. You could look at this from a few vantage points, but let's just zero in because we've already talked about the psychological science of some of this stuff. Let's zero in on that for a second. The science on what gives people a sense of meaning, there are three pillars that support our sense of meaning in life. The first is coherence. So, coherence has to do with whether or not I can pick up on whether reality, the story I'm living in, has some sort of repeatable, discernible pattern. I think of in the scriptures, there's the teacher of Ecclesiastes. And if you ever read Ecclesiastes, it sounds in many ways depressing and miserable. Why? He's wrestling with whether or not there
Right.
is any coherence. He goes, well, why one day I look at it and I feel like really righteous people are suffering and really wicked people are living in the lap of luxury.
It's a
You know,
book everybody should read because what,
everybody.
2,800 years old now, and it
That's
seems
right.
like it's off the newspaper from yesterday.
Absolutely. It's timeless questions he's wrestling with. He's wrestling with the question of coherence. And we have to have a sense that, yeah, there's some repeatable, discernible, rational pattern to all of this. The second pillar is purpose. Purpose has to do with if there is some sort of coherent, ordered pattern to all of this, is it pointing in a direction, a telos, an end goal? Is there a end purpose to this group project we call life? And if you don't have a sense of purpose, like what's the direction this is all heading in, you will experience an absence of meaning. But you could have both of those things. You could have a sense of, well, I see some sort of like coherent pattern to all of this in life, and it makes some sense. And I think there's even might be an end goal to it all. But the third vital pillar is significance. Significance has to do with, do I play any meaningful role in that story? Do I matter to others? And so, what we really want, John, is not like temporary dopamine hits. We're surrounded by that. And you can ask anybody that's grown up in the age of social media, they have infinite temporary spikes of happiness. And then they go off maybe to their room at night, and before they hop into bed, they reflect on their day and they feel this absence of meaning. You don't just want those temporary hits. You want to live in a story that's coherent, it's purposeful, and it gives you some role to play in the story. And that's why people are so fascinated throughout time, John, with the hero's journey stories. Whether it's we're going to have this summer, we're going to have a retelling of Homer's The Odyssey, or maybe it's the original Star Wars trilogy and the story of Luke Skywalker moving from an insignificant moisture farmer, I still haven't figured out what that is, right, to the kind of person that's willing to lay down his life to save others, to rescue others, or even Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where Frodo, this insignificant hobbit, goes on a journey together with friends. They weren't happy at every moment of those journeys. What they did get at the end was meaning, and that's what people really are after.
Mm. You write a lot about cynicism and wisdom. What's the difference between those two?
Yeah. So interesting. People I think have long confused this term primarily because of the sort of anti-story energy, the postmodern anti-story energy in our culture. And a lot of the stories that fill our screens have portrayed the cynic as being the smartest person in the room. I think of like in the mid 2000s, that show House MD, right? House is this doctor who's the most cynical guy, but they also portray him as the most intelligent. In the end of every episode, he's figured out the problem. And it's because of his cynicism. Or for Gen Z audiences, like the comedy Rick and Morty, and Rick is like the most intelligent guy, but he's also the most cynical guy. And interestingly enough, the science on that shows that isn't the case. In fact, recent studies on highly cynical people actually show that in tests of cognitive ability, they score lower. Because cynicism, the spirit of cynicism, is about closing and walling off potential solutions because you need to be right. It's a protective, defensive mechanism. You're so afraid of perhaps being naive. And you don't want to be naive, right? You don't want to be naive because if you're naive, you might become the victim. And a lot of that was baked into the postmodern anti-story. A lot of stuff about oppressors and oppressed, these two classes of people. And, if you want to not be oppressed, you should be highly cynical because everybody's out to oppress you. Nobody wants to be taken advantage of. And so we build these psychological walls that keep ourselves insulated from not just the possibility of not being victimized, but also the possibility of something better.
Yeah.
Wisdom is about appropriately adhering to reality as it is. It's finding, am I going with the grain of reality? Or am I going against the grain? And you know what? Oftentimes in my own life, John, I have found that I was going against the grain of reality. I was going against what is true. I was going against what is good. And I was going against what is beautiful. And the cynic struggles to see what might be true, good, and beautiful beyond their limited frame. And so cynicism is not wisdom. And in fact, it's not even true intellect. I actually think there's another side. We get through, I use a term in the book called post-cynical. The really intelligent people that I know are not totally naive. They have gone on the other side of cynicism. They
Right.
walked through, Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, called it the desert of criticism. And you go through the desert of criticism. And once you get through the other side, maybe some of that cynicism, you had some lessons you needed to learn. But if you stay in that place forever, you're a miserable person. I mean,
Mm.
not just your own happiness, you're miserable to other people. So on the other side of cynicism, there's this fresh, you could call it new sincerity, this new sense of I can be earnest and sincere again. I don't always have to hedge my bets. I don't always have to, in even conversations with friends that are close to me, I don't have to lace every word with irony, and be like, well, I'm not, I don't really mean what I say. We can say what we mean. We can be open again. We can be aspirational again. We can be sincere again. And I think that's the major difference between cynicism and wisdom.
So help us begin turning this broad story, almost like a macroeconomic
Yeah.
story of life, into one that is very individualized and applicable. How do I, as a listener, laying out at a pool right now here in this conversation or driving the kids to school or getting a workout in or whatever else I'm doing while they're listening to this conversation, apply what you're talking about in my individual life.
Yeah. So one thing I've been telling people recently, and this is really challenging because we live in an age of information in which we are consuming more information than any human prior to us. It's unprecedented. Every scroll we're taking in, I mean, we cannot process it all. And so one practical tip I've been telling people recently is to just kind of pay attention to the wholesome. And what I mean by that is pay attention to what makes you feel whole. And that's different than happy, right? Happy has to do with that like dopamine spike. I tell a story of a guy in my book named Jordan Hall. Jordan Hall is one of the most brilliant men I've ever been around. He's never told me his IQ. I'd have to guess it's probably in the 165 range. He was the founder and CEO of DivX. That was one of the first internet video platforms. Made a ton of money, sold that company, and then he found himself throughout the 2010s wrestling with questions of meaning, looking around, going, I think we're headed towards a real disaster if we don't find a story that can hold not just my own longings for meaning, but can hold us all together. And he did it all. I mean, he's friends with Nobel Prize winning intellects, traveled the world, and his journeys brought him to this little town in North Carolina. And one day, him and his wife, the neighbors had invited him over to just a family birthday party, and it was a 2-year-old's, just someone in the neighborhood. And they were sitting there, and someone asked him at the birthday party, "Hey, you want to come to church with us this Sunday?" And Jordan described it as, he had studied all the world religions, been around the block, did all the philosophy, the New Age stuff. He knew it all. And the thing that stood out to him was that invitation struck him as wholesome and as inviting as someone going, "Hey, do you want to just go pick up ice cream, from the corner ice cream store?"
Right.
And that's all. It landed with him as like, yeah, that's an interesting invitation. And he was so tired of the nihilism and despair that he's like, I think I just want to follow. Yeah, you kind of remember in the Looney Tunes stories of like Pepe Le Pew, right? And when he kind of got the beautiful cat that he was in love with, and he would kind of following his nose to chase after that cat. He was kind of just following his nose to that. Shows up at church, doesn't know what to make of any of the doctrines or anything like that. But he looked around and saw the people. And he was like, here are people across different generations, across different political teams who love each other. They take care of each other. And that stood out to him. He had spent time in Silicon Valley and in
Right.
every epicenter of the world in which people are searching for solutions to our civilizational problem. And he sat there and he felt what we could call the sense of resonance. Like something resonated inside him. This is wholesome. This works. He didn't need the threat of violence to keep that person sitting across from him in the pew from robbing him or stealing from him.
Right.
There was trust there. And so that took Jordan on this interesting journey where he was like, something here is good. And he couldn't get away from it. And he said he treated it like one of his startups. He spent about 16 hours a day, every single day for months, reading every work of theology he could get his hands on, reading scripture, wrestling with philosophy, to try to get where his head was at to match that felt sense of wholesomeness. And in the end, he found those two merging together. The story, he could piece it together with that real sense of resonance with the wholesome. So one of the things I'm encouraging people to do is just pay attention to where the wholesome is. And we see this all over culture and in some interesting ways. People are finding it going back to church. Young people are doing that. They're also finding it in the movie theater. There's been, I think of a film in this past year like Project Hail Mary, and it was a box office success. People loved it. But one of the things I kept hearing from people that left the movie theater is they went, it's really interesting. I don't think there was a single swear word in that movie. And I'm not
Yeah.
saying like swearing is the end all or abomination. I could go to the movie with my kids. And the story was about like selfless sacrifice and it wasn't cynical. Oh, that felt so good. What are they describing? They're describing the thing that we all are searching for is all of the fragmented pieces of our life to come together. So, as the beginning of maybe a reconstruction journey, so deconstruction was about tearing down, and we got to eventually rebuild. I would say one little step to take is just pay attention to the wholesome. Pay attention to the wholesome and where that leads. You might find that someone that went to church and you grew up in church and you got jaded and angry, and suddenly you find yourself saddled up next to some aged and seasoned saint singing Great is Thy Faithfulness, and you go, oh man, that feels better than all the cynicism. It might feel like, oh man, I suddenly have some of these values that my grandparents had that I set aside as being backwards. And now I'm realizing, oh, there was something wholesome there. As a first step, I would just say, pay attention to the wholesome.
It's good. You write about this hope that you have for society. I think you are in the minority here. The Wall Street Journal, I know last year had three different articles that the American dream is dead. Not like we're losing grasp on it, but that essentially hope for a better life tomorrow than yesterday is not within your grasp anymore. Sorry. More at 10 o'clock tonight. And yet you think there's reason to believe that cultural renewal and hope is already being rebuilt. Would give me some examples of why?
Well, here's the first example why. I think it was the sociologist Christian Smith who said, humans are not just animals that tell stories, they are shaped by stories. The story that we tell actually will shape how we even perceive reality itself. So there's this term, mean world syndrome. The sociologist, I believe his name was William Gerbner in the 1960s, and this has been demonstrated over and over again. He found they did an interesting study on people that consumed, violent, dark media, even back in the 1960s, everything from, film, television, right? And he found this really interesting thing that's been borne out in repeated experiments again and again. The more that people consumed stories that said the world was dark, terrible place, the more they tended to overestimate how dark and terrible the world was. So they would watch a bunch of, dark crime movies and stories, and you ask them, well, is crime worse today than it was 20 years ago? And everybody be like, yeah, absolutely. But the data actually shows that it isn't. Per capita homicide rates right now, John, are comparable to what they were in the 1950s. Okay, you ask anybody on the streets, is there more murder? Well, there's more people, but per capita, it's roughly about the same as the 1950s. So I have to say, the story that we tell, the future is open, right? Like
Yeah.
from our vantage point, the future is open, John. Like this, if I keep telling myself this story that my neighborhood is doomed, my family is doomed, that Mad Max dystopian, story is our inevitable future, you know what I'm going to get? I am going to get that story. It's mean world syndrome. I think,
Yeah.
John, that what we can do, and this is like the actual warning of those stories, we actually can change the future. These outcomes are not inevitable, right? They're not inevitable. I have to go back to, to my childhood, and I think of the story of Jonah. The story of Jonah and the people of Nineveh. Jonah comes and he tells the people of Nineveh, right? Hey, judgment day is coming for your town. And what do? They go, boy, we really got to change our ways. And guess what happens? Judgment didn't come.
Yeah.
They didn't get the zombie apocalypse scene. It did change. So I firmly believe this, and this is why we have to tell better stories. I think of your own story, John, and the guts it took to work through and turn that into a film. We need stories like that because as we tell that story, it opens up for us the possibilities to say, hang on a second. No, this can change. Like, this isn't a foregone conclusion.
Right.
I can change. I can step in. People my age are going to get a dose of reality here, John. And that's happening right now, especially over the next 5 years. As baby boomers move increasingly into retirement, all of our institutions, which have been primarily run by that generation, from government to colleges to local public schools, millennials, older Zoomers are going to be thrust into positions of either leading those institutions or those institutions are going to collapse. Now, what story do you want to believe as if you get tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, I need you to run this company? Do you want to believe that it's doomed in the end and it's all going Mad Max? Well, you're done from the get-go if you believe that story. So I think we can tell a better story. And this isn't just silver linings interpreting reality. It's the realization that the story I tell myself, I actually live into.
Mm. So I think of when I walk into my mom and dad's house, the very first thing I do is turn off their cable news channel. And I won't tell our listeners and viewers what they're watching, but I will let you know it's on 24 hours a day,
Oh, good.
informing them that half of the world is against them.
Right.
And I walk into my aunt's house and she feels the same thing is happening, but from the other side of the aisle. And the
Yeah.
first thing I do when I walk into my aunt's house is turn off that stupid television and the lie that half of the world in their own country is out to get them. Because the mean signal syndrome, I think that you were referencing a moment
Yeah.
ago, is influencing their thoughts, their dreams, their faith, and their life, and informing them that the American dream is dead and gone. And
Mhm.
you're reminding us that the stories we live into become our reality. It's a great
Absolutely.
reminder. Remind us again where we can learn more about your work and the book that you
Yeah.
wrote.
Yeah, so the book is called Based on a True Story, Vibe Shifts, The End of Deconstruction, and the Reboot of Meaning. It's available pretty much wherever you buy books, Amazon, Target. I don't know who buys books from Target, but that stood out to me. I
My
saw it at
wife,
Target. Yeah, great. I
we've
saw
saved so much money by saving 10% buying books at Target. I can't tell you how much money we save at
Yeah,
sale.
that's awesome. If you like audiobooks too, it'll be available as an audiobook. I read, and it will be in my voice for better or worse. July 14th, you can find it anywhere. Hopefully, it will be something that you can read, but also I wrote it for people that have gone through that deconstruction journey and they're trying to find out a way out of it. So maybe you think of somebody in your life. I think of plenty of people my age and younger who went through that stuff, and they need to get handed a book like this and shown that cynicism, that despair, that absence of meaning you're feeling. You don't have to feel that way
Yeah,
anymore. You don't have
so
to
good.
live in that story. And so people can pick up the book there. You can listen to the audio. You can find me, the social media platform I'm most active on is X. You can go to paulanleitner.org, or you can check out the organization I lead called Goodmakers, which is a leadership network and a group of leaders that are interested in the same shared project that I think you and I have together, John, which is like, how do we renew culture? How do we tell a better story? How do we give people hope and meaning? And how do we transform this so that the America our kids and God willing, our grandkids are handed is actually better than what we have? I'm hopeful that
Great.
that can happen.
I completely agree. So, Paul, we have 7 questions that we tether all of our mighty guests to. They're called the Live Inspired Seven. So,
Oh,
buckle
fun.
up, brother. Here we
Let's
go.
go.
I know you're well read, so question 1 will be difficult for you. It's easier for me. Here it is. What's been the most impactful book you've ever read?
Most impactful for me, outside of the Bible, because that's kind of what I was born and raised on. We'll take that one as a given. In college, a mentor handed me a copy of the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard's anthology of his best work called Provocations. And
Yeah.
that helped spark my own interest in philosophy because I was a jock in high school. And so that was crucial in me being opened up to a world of deeper thinking, grappling with the deep questions of life.
There's a quote in there that goes, "Life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward."
Absolutely,
And that
absolutely.
book is pretty solid, man. So, what's
Yes.
one positive characteristic or one trait that you possessed as a little boy growing up outside Detroit that you
Mhm.
wish you exhibited as brilliantly today?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm really thankful. I won't roll up my sleeves. I have a tattoo on my left forearm that represents resilience, overcoming. My dad was a Hall of Fame middle linebacker at Detroit's Wayne State University at 5'10", 190 pounds, and he was a tough Detroit guy, but he passed on to us resilience. And so that's one of my biggest values, the characteristics that I hope I carry and can pass on to my own kids is perseverance, resilience, keep going, right? Once you find yourself in the belly of the underworld, all of the great stories show this. This is part of the hero's journey. When you are in the belly of the underworld, when you're walking through hell itself, it's also your greatest moment of revelation. And when you come out the other side of that, you have a gift to bring to the world. All the stories, the great stories show that cycle. And so if you're in that place, keep going, keep going. Don't give up in the belly of the whale.
Hmm. If your home caught fire and all living things are out and you have an opportunity, Paul, of running back in and grabbing one item, what's the one thing you would grab?
Wow, man. That's an excellent question. Yeah, got my kids out of the house. Yeah, my wife can attest to this. I'm pretty minimalist on my possessions. So, I might grab some comic books actually, which are hard to replace. Some old comic books. That seems weird and random, but they bear a special place in my heart and my life. I think of the role comic books played on me as a kid. Wasn't much of a reader when I was young. So comic books were actually another helpful way for me. It wasn't just about bam, pow, you think of the Batman 1966 show. Comic books are a way of telling stories that we are akin to the ancient Greek myths. And so I think back fondly on the role comic books played in getting me to grapple with deeper questions. So I got some on my back shelf there. I'd probably grab a handful of those because those are hard to replace.
If you could sit on a bench with anyone on a gorgeous Minneapolis day and have a long conversation with anybody, living or dead, who would you like to be seated next to?
C.S. Lewis, probably. I think I would want to sit down with C.S. Lewis. There's a million other people that come to mind, but Lewis was the first one that stood out to me. And Lewis was so prescient in so many ways. I've been going through the last couple of years his space trilogy. Everybody's familiar with Lewis's work in Mere Christianity or the Narnia books. But his space trilogy stuff has just stood out to me as being so prescient for the days we're living in now. I would have loved to sit down with Lewis and heard his story on a personal level and pick his brain.
Mm. I love when brilliant cynics become people of faith. There's a
Yeah.
depth to what they talk about that those of us who are somehow more innocent can't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis is pretty awesome. What's the best advice Lewis or anyone else ever gave you?
These are killer questions, John. So good. I wouldn't say this is the best, but this is one might be on the Mount Rushmore that stood out to me, and it just helped me vocationally. A friend of mine years ago said, and is freedom or is tyranny? And what he meant by that was I was kind of processing vocational decisions and what I want to do with my life. And he reminded me that, in many ways, part of our American story when people first introduce themselves is they go, well, what do you do? Right. And you become defined by maybe one singular profession. I do this. And I've always had a range of interests. I'm doing a number of things all the time. And it was encouraging that I don't have to be defined by a singular thing. That doesn't define me. And I can do this. And I serve in my local church as a pastor. And I help lead a nonprofit. And I write books. And I'm a father. And I've coached youth sports. So there's a lot of freedom and I think that's maybe
Mm.
just one very practical piece of wisdom that stands out to me.
What advice would you give yourself at age 20?
Oh gosh, age 20. What was I doing at age 20? Finishing up, in university. I would probably say be less cynical. I wouldn't have seen myself as cynical. Maybe I would say be more open to learning things beyond your current horizon. That's probably what I would have told myself. Be more open to wisdom that you do not have right now. Don't be so locked into thinking that you have it figured out. I mean, I think that's probably a normal feature of being a young
Mm.
man at that age. And, I'd also say on top of that, I'll sneak in a second point. If there was something that I could say that would help, and we could have a whole nother podcast conversation about this, to help me unblur I had very neat lines between sacred and secular. And so this notion that this part of my life, this private part of my life that's about spiritual things is really, really important. But, like working an ordinary job or doing ordinary mundane things is less than that. That was a real struggle I had. And so if there was anything I could have told 20-year-old me to be like, no, those mundane things are charged. I think Gerard Manley Hopland says, it's charged with the grandeur of God. There is something sacred in the ordinary tasks of doing your dishes, taking your kids to the park. It actually took me a while to see that. So I wish I could have seen that a little sooner in life, but we learned.
And had your friend that you mentioned left her husband and kids for the beach, heard that, I think she may have recognized, as we all would, that what
Mhm.
you're currently having is what you're currently seeking. Like the very thing you already have might, in fact, be the life you wish you might one day get. It is in the ordinary that we recognize the extraordinary. So here's the final question, Paul. It has been said that all great people can have their lives summed up in one sentence. How would you like yours to read?
He gave it his best. You know, I think maybe that's the blue collar Detroit kid in me. It's also the recognition that grace precedes me. I am in myself quite limited. I am flawed, but I want to respond well to the moments I've been given. And all I can do in the end is go down swinging, you know. I hope people would say, yeah, that's a guy that gave it his best.
Paul Anleitner gave it his best and shared with the rest of us how we might do likewise in the book based on a true story and through the gift of his life. Paul, I want to thank you for bringing light into the world. I want to thank you for being my friend and for reminding the rest of us to push back on cynicism, to embrace the gift of faith, and to recognize that the best is yet to come.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
My friends, that's Paul. I'm John. Today's your day. What a gift it is. Live with your soul on fire. Well, my friends, family, brothers and sisters, Paul's conversation today reminded us that the stories we consume do more than entertain us. They shape how we see ourselves, how we feel about one another, and what we believe about our future. If we're constantly surrounded by stories of fear and of division and of hopelessness, it's easy to believe that that is all that there is for us. But when we intentionally seek out stories rooted in truth, in beauty, in goodness, and in hope, everything around us begins to change because everything within us changed first. If you enjoyed this conversation, you'll love the conversation I had a couple years ago with my buddy, had a couple with him. His name is Greg Easterbrook. Greg joined us to share a really compelling story, fact-based case that despite the headlines that often tell us it's never been worse than this, the reality is this might in fact be the very best time to be alive in all of human history. Just because it's a story the media does not cover doesn't make it so, my friends. Check it out. You'll love it. He joined me to explain why we are wired to notice the negative, how the media can distort our perspective, and why choosing optimism is one of the wisest decisions that we can make in life. It's a conversation that encouraged me. It's one that will absolutely inspire you. Check it out way back in time, episode 121, or cruise with me right now over to the website, johnolearyinspires.com/podcast. And on that beautiful website, I'll have a link in the show notes of episode 121 directing you into that conversation with Greg. Well, family and friends, grateful and honored every time you spend a little bit of your day with me. Looking forward to spending the next time with you. So for this time and until that time, my name is John O'Leary. Today is your day. What a gift. Live with your soul on fire. Keeley Companies was started almost 50 years ago by the one and only Larry Keeley. What started as a small family-owned paving company in St. Louis has grown to a nationally known full-service construction, development, and restoration partner. Larry the Legend, as he is affectionately known, has been a part of this growth every step of the way and continues to provide guidance as his son, Rusty, my buddy, drives their vision and achieves results on purpose. His unwavering foundation of a family culture with a focus on people has gotten Keeley Companies to where they are today, and their journey is truly just beginning. To learn more about Larry the Legend and Keeley Companies, check them out at KeeleyCompanies.com.